Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on agroforestry hosted by Regenerative Outcomes. We're pleased to be joined by a great lineup of speakers this evening. So Alan Williams from Understanding Ag is going to kick us off. Alan is one of the partners at Understanding Ag who consult over 30 million acres of farmland across North America and the UK. He's going to give us an introduction to how agroforestry can work within a regenerative agriculture system, so kind of understanding how agroforestry fits within this kind of 634 framework that Understanding Ag use. And then Pete Leeson from the Woodland Trust is going to talk around the why of agroforestry. Pete's based in Cumbria and is a really well-respected kind of woodland officer there, and has done a lot of brilliant work with farmers, getting trees onto farms in ways that complement farming businesses. So I look forward to that. And then Edd Colbert is going to say a few words around agroforestry design. So Ed was one of the driving forces behind the really successful agroforestry show that happened for the first time in September 23, and also works as a consultant designing agroforestry systems for farmers. Just a couple of points of housekeeping. There's a Q&A function in Teams that hopefully you can use. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentations, and we'll potentially take a couple of questions after each presentation as they appear. And then we're hoping that the presentations will be done by around 7:45, and so there'll be a good 20 minutes or so to take any outstanding questions at that point. I believe both Peter and Ed have to head off around 8 p.m. But Alan will be here until around 15:15. So yeah, don't hold back with your questions. And without further ado, Alan, I think I've enabled your mic and camera, so hopefully be able to share your screen and have a crack at presenting. If not, then I'll drop Alan an email just to resolve any technical issues. And Pete, would you be happy to crack on with your presentation while just get Alan up and running? That'd be all right.
Yes. Yeah, I was hoping to listen to him first and get some good points to talk about, but
no worries.
I'm happy to go with that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pete.
Shall I just get cracking then?
Yeah, fire away. Fire away.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming along. As I said, I thought I'd have a few more minutes just to relax into this, but there we go. So just a wee bit of background. I'm a chartered surveyor by training, but I got the conservation bug quite a few years ago, and I've been working with the Woodland Trust for 30 years. And about half of that time, I've spent working with farmers and landowners, and not with Woodland Trust land, but with land that we don't own. So working with landowners, farmers, to try and work with them on their land to see how we can integrate trees into their daily lives, if you like. And my particular interest is regenerative farming. And latterly, I've started doing a podcast called Tree Amble. And if you'd like to hear the stories of a number of regenerative farmers that we've been working with on there, please go and have a listen to that, Tree Amble. So if you like, I come at this agroforestry from a very pragmatic, very practical end. I am interested in seeing a more treed landscape because I think those trees can really function for us across a very wide range of things. So I'm a real pro advocate for trees, but they have to be valued. They have to add value to our farm systems. And when we put a tree into somewhere, I think we need to make sure it's in the right place. And in a sense, I think what I've been doing for the last 15 years is very much agroforestry. So my practical, simple definition of agroforestry is that it's about adding woody matter to a farm to aid its productivity. Now, that might not be the technical definition of agroforestry, but for me it works because it means that if we're adding trees into a farm system, we're thinking about adding value to that farm. It's not just about trees because they're pretty. It's not just about biodiversity, although that's important. It's about how will that farm take on that tree or hedge or whatever it is and add value to the farm. But thinking about agroforestry in the wider sense, it could be taken in a number of different ways. Lots of people talk about agroforestry in the sense of animals and trees working together. You could include within that wood pasture. You could have field trees, which animals shelter or shade under. You could have hedgerows, which animals shade behind, the leaf browse that comes with those. So animals with trees or hedges, very important part of agroforestry. And perhaps that's what I do most of. In other parts of the country, and perhaps in the northeast, this is more so than in Cumbria, but arable and trees is also possible. We've got lots of people we've worked with over the years who have added fruit trees into arable systems, or nut trees, or even strips of productive woodland, alternating rows of productive woodland or nut trees or fruit trees with combinable cropping. And there's some fantastic examples in Cambridgeshire where that's been done very effectively. At its extreme, we can look at agroforestry in terms of forest gardens or even permaculture. So looking at how we utilize that woody material to drive productivity in a very layered way. So you might, for example, have nut trees above fruit trees with fruits or nuts on the ground and vegetables in the system. Now that's more akin to perhaps a tropical or subtropical approach to agroforestry, but it's still in this agroforestry zone. So my view of agroforestry then is it's about trees on your farm. Now, in the last few years, there's been a real increase in interest in trying to look at the value of trees, hedges, and other woody vegetation on farms. I was sat with a researcher last week, and he was saying he was amazed how over the last half century, how little research has gone into natural systems, natural processes, and how much research by volume and value has gone into looking at things like chemical applications, fungicides, herbicides, pesticides. There's a huge volume of research gone into that side of agriculture. A tiny proportion has gone into this side, if you like, which is the more working with nature side. But in the last 15 years, 20 years, there's been a lot more going to this side. And what's interesting is farms have always had woody material on them. We've reduced that over the years by mechanization, but trees have always formed historically a big part of farms. And they would have been used in the past for timber for burning, for making implements with, for hurdles, for hedge laying, all sorts of different purposes. And we've lost one of those needs, perhaps, but we've also lost some of those skills. But now we're moving into a space where we're thinking about carbon sequestration with climate change, water stress, and I'm thinking about both too much water, but also too little water. And we're looking at the impacts of having soil loss, fertilizer loss, ammonia loss from farms, and thinking about how we might use woody material to actually combat some of those. So in a sense, that need for trees and woody material on farms, in a sense, has never been greater, but we've had to reinvent the science and the thinking behind that. So just looking a little bit at the science or what people are thinking about behind agroforestry before we go into some of the benefits of it. I don't know if people are aware of Claire Whittle. She's a vet. And she is incredibly passionate about integrating trees into farms. And as a vet, I think it's really worth looking at what she's been doing because she's extremely concerned about the future with climate predictions as they are. Now, her own take is healthy animals in healthy ecosystems. She calls herself, aka Weekend Poo Fiddler, which I thought was amusing. Claire has done an awful lot of research with dung beetles and the benefits of dung beetles in the landscape, in the way they take material down into the soils, they help to reduce fly impact in animals, etc., etc. She's done a piece of work recently looking at climate predictions, which are Met Office government predictions, looking at 2050 and the predictions for periods of 2 weeks plus at 40 degrees in this country. And her vet approach to this is that the effect on cattle of not having shade and shelter is significant. It will add to loss of fertility, loss of condition, poor yield and body condition. And her version of events is climate change may be the best reason why you now need to think about putting trees and hedges back into your farms if you've got cattle. Shade and shelter are very important to them. There's a project in Bangor University looking at shade and shelter and the benefits to animals. And they found that animals either in a really warm field in hot sunshine or in maybe a cold wet day in North Wales, 2 degrees and raining, those animals are using 10 to 15% more energy in either staying warm or keeping cool. That's been backed up by a piece of research where it's shown that mothering ewes in lambing will preferentially go for sheltered spots in fields rather than open exposed areas. I'm sure many of you will be aware of Pontbren, Mid Wales. They had to really consider how they were lambing and their sheep needs. And quite a few years ago, they set out to change the landscape so that they could outdoor lamb, outdoor rear. And so they put loads of shelter belts back into that landscape and changed the nature of their sheep breeds. What they found was that the shelter belts and hedges extended the seasonality in the grasses near to them. Now, there's a range of things going on there, whether it was reduction in wind speeds, it just improved in terms of temperature longer in the year, plus also moisture and decompaction of soils, but also mycorrhizal fungi also affecting grasses. So it's really interesting studies. Again, multiple people have been looking at the additionality that hedges and tree leaves can bring to browse for animal health. I was in a seminar recently where someone was suggesting that cows fed on ryegrass only are less likely to take up all of the sugars and nutrients in that ryegrass unless they have additional fibre added in. So with leaf browse, that additional fibre going into the animal will help them help to increase the intake of nutrients and sugars from the grasses. So fibre is really important to animal health and well-being. So again, browse from leaf litter, trees, hedges is really important. We now know there's a relationship between tree roots, plant roots, mycorrhizal fungi, and how nutrients and soil moisture move through the ground. These have only really become acknowledged in the last few years. We've now got the computing and the science behind that can actually identify what these processes are. But we didn't really have much understanding about how roots in soils worked with soil. And that's now becoming apparent. Another agroforestry thing which people have been researching, Stephen Briggs has been looking at his arable system. He's included about 7 or 8% of his land into fruit trees in an arable rotation. So wide alleys, fruit trees between them. He's now combining down the alleys and he's taking fruit trees off between the alleys. So he's got a second crop and it's the increased productivity, but also reduced wind speeds, more soil moisture, etc. The same goes for Dartington in Devon, where they're looking at trees in arable or tree and vegetable systems. I'm aware through my work with the Rivers Trusts and others, we've been looking at lots of flooding. I live in Keswick. We've been flooded 3 times in the last 20 years. And we've been working with farmers on putting hedgerows into the pathway of watercourses to reduce the flow to store water. But we've also noticed that there's increased soil percolation around hedges, and that's helping in drought conditions just the same for grasses. And another area of interest, Martin Wolf down in Wakelands in Suffolk was looking at using agroforestry to break up disease transfer in crops. And he found that by breaking up your arable rotation with permanent lines of hazel and other species, you reduced the transfer of disease plant to plant through the farm quite considerably. I can't remember exactly what the figures were, but they were quite considerable. So the science has grown. There's been lots of people researching elements of the agroforestry system. So I've just thought about what the benefits of agroforestry are in terms of two main systems. One is livestock, one is arable. I've already mentioned some of these things, but I'll run through them as sort of individual things, but they do all stack in some way. So we're not going to plant just for shade and shelter. We'll plant for other things as well, including browse or water. But let's look at those individually. So shade and shelter, I've outlined before that these are critical for animals in terms of their well-being, and particularly in a climate scenario where we might have really long, dry, hot summers. Cattle are particularly prone to problems in very hot conditions. I saw somebody recently who said they've actually built a pond specifically to allow the cattle into it in hot conditions. But we need to think about their welfare and well-being. Shade and shelter are critical, but with shade and shelter comes browse. So leaves provide animals with roughage, sugars, protein, dry matter, and in some cases, leaves of trees can be higher than grass at certain points in the year, and you know, it's not a given, but they can provide just as much or more in some certain cases. Seasonality in grasses, where you've got shade, shelter, you've got wind reduction and different soil makeup because of tree roots, you can have additional seasonality in grasses, which may well make the difference between your animals going to a shed several weeks earlier or later. Soil health. Soils have come up the agenda massively in recent years. And we all know situations locally where we can see soil that is significantly affected by compaction. Now, agroforestry systems tend to have a lot less issues related to compaction because of tree roots going down, breaking up soil panning. With additional earthworm activity and with the aeration around tree roots, that can also open up for water management down into the soil and better water circulation. So reduces compaction, reduces the effects of compaction, and adds value by taking that water down into the ground where we need it in hot summers. Soil fertility. This is aided and abetted by plants such as alder, which is naturally nitrogen fixing. So it has nodules on the roots that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the ground. But also the leaf fall and leaf transfer is basically taking nutrients which are gained from really deep in the soil through the tree up into its leaves and then dropped onto the soil surface to be taken into the soil if you have a healthy earthworm population. I know lots of farmers now that go out with a spade and regularly count their earthworms, and they're heading ideally towards 20 earthworms per big spade. And if you've got that, you've got the nutrient cycling going on. Trees planted in the right way, and I'm thinking particularly actually of chicken or hen situations. Trees can reduce the impacts of diffuse pollution, such as ammonia loss. David Brass over here has done a lot of work with this in terms of his egg units, and now requires a new egg unit to have 20% of its range covered in trees. It's partly to do with animal welfare and hens, but also partly to do with breaking down ammonia. We've talked about reducing soils and sediment loss in terms of that runoff, particularly in extreme situations. Hedgerows are fantastic at keeping soils where they should be on fields. They're also fantastic in disrupting the loss of fertilizers and fertility from fields. Agroforestry systems, you can't consider an agroforestry system without general animal welfare. Animals like being in and around trees, and cattle certainly do. there's if you see cattle turned out into the field in the spring, it's got lots of trees in it, lots of leaves. They are running and bouncing and jumping and looking for those leaves. They like browsing on trees. Another benefit of agroforestry is biomass. And I saw some figures last year about the biomass value of hedges when they're laid. People taking material out of hedges to provide wood fuel for the house. So that again shouldn't be underestimated. The Pont Bren example, they were taking biomass from hedges, putting it through a chipper, using that biomass to then go into the sheep barns and things when they had housing animals in the winter. So really short, closing that circuit, but they were not buying in stuff, they're providing their own chips. I was at the Oxford Real Farming Conference last week, and a couple of the fruit growers there were talking about using their hedges and willow in particular for chipping, and using those small chippings as mulches around some of their fruit trees. So again, short circuiting, they're producing their own biomass, they're using it on site. Those chips were then providing mulch, so reduction in weeds, but then also adding fertility to those soils where they need it around the roots. So biomass is a really important part of the agroforestry system. In arable systems, I both love and hate this photograph here of this tractor. I can't imagine what's going through that person's head when they're seeing that really valuable asset, the soil, literally blowing away. We've got lots of effort going into looking at trees in arable systems. And yes, there's always going to be a machinery issue there in terms of how do you plant your trees so that you still can crop effectively and efficiently. But people are doing it. And what they're finding is that there is better water management under trees. And that can be either reduced transpiration of the crop and water loss from a crop where you've got wind speeds which are reduced, or it could be through increased water retention in soils and increased percolation. So the way a tree root works is it goes down deep, it opens up the soil beneath you, it works with the mycorrhizal fungi and transports moisture and sugars away. But there's always air pockets around those roots, and those air pockets allow for the percolation of water down into the soil. They act as temporary reservoirs. So waters tend to be drawn down by tree roots. Many people think that trees will dry out land, and in some cases they can certainly help with that, but trees they're not designed to leave themselves in a desert. They're actually designed to store and manage water. Trees can significantly break up soil compaction, and where that's a problem on a farm, increased trees or hedgerows can help with soil panning. I've spelt soil wrong there, but again, increased soil fertility is a benefit with trees. Oh, sorry. Another thing which people have been looking at is we've responded to pests and insects in recent years by spraying. What the organic farmers are doing, lots of the regen people are doing, is looking at whether or not by increasing the diversity of trees and other plants on farms is whether we can actually increase the beneficial pollinator pest relationships. And there's a lot of research now saying that is possible. So the more different things you have, the more likely you are to have things like ladybirds coming in, eating your aphids, etc. You've got increased bird populations, and they're going to be coming in taking your caterpillars. So there's a lot of work going into that, and in many cases that's becoming critical for people that don't want to use pesticides. Another arable benefit, and again I go back to Stephen Briggs in Cambridgeshire, looking at alternative crops. So a field might provide you with 2 or 3 or 4 different sorts of crops, and also a cash crop at a point in the year when actually your cash flow is low, you haven't got other incomes coming in. And Stephen has got something like 7 or 8% of his arable land under a fruit crop, and he he claims not to have lost any overall productivity on the wheat or the arable crop, because he sees the benefits of having these alternative crops in there, and also what they're doing for the soil and the water. So there are things to think about there. So yeah, what I would say is, please consider whether you think you would benefit now and in the future from having more hedges or trees on your farm. And I would say inside or outside of woods. We did some research about 2 years ago, and we looked at the UK, and we worked out the canopy of tree cover is about 50% in woods and about 50% outside of woods. So the tree canopy itself is, you know, the trees in hedgerows, in fields, make up about half of our woodland canopy. So they're incredibly important, and their function is really important. So if you think you could benefit from more of those, that's something we'd like to hear about. Please consider getting advice from people like myself, Woodland Trust, or others. I've got a small budget that can help people in Cumbria. I really rate small and beautiful, and I really rate people doing something small in 1 year, thinking about it, observing what's going on, and then coming back and doing a bit more the next year. And we've got lots of people we've worked with over many years who have done little bits every year and are now really building some kind of plan for their farm. The government announced new SFI and CS rates in the last week. Some of those are really quite good now for various things, including riparian habitats. Yeah, I made some notes earlier, but anyway, creation of upland wood pasture is a really good payment, £544 a hectare. Go and seek out Claire Whittle's stuff online, and talk to Claire about what she thinks for 2050 and how cattle need to be managed. And I think if you listen to her and see what she's coming up with, then you will want to create wood pasture for your cattle. It's a good payment. Also look at SFI for other conservation farm features. There's also going to be an agroforestry grant coming up, and that's going to be announced, I think, shortly, or coming into being shortly. I'm really interested to see what that looks like, and I think there could be some interesting things in there about how formulaic they want that to be. I don't know yet, but that'll be interesting. There we go. I hope you've enjoyed that, and it's given you some things to think about.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you very much, Pete. That was a great kind of summary now of all the kind of different strands of evidence that have been built up over the years in the UK as to kind of the benefits we can get on farm from integrating trees. And just to say as well that if you're part of the Regenerative Outcomes programme, we're pleased to be working with the Woodland Trust to get trees onto farms. So kind of come and, if you're part of the programme, come and talk to us, and we'll get you in touch with your local Woodland Trust officer in that region, and then we can include the carbon stock increases from your agroforestry as kind of part of that, along with the soils, to earn verified carbon units as well. So just to plug that. And if people have any questions for Pete, please be popping them into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get a chance to return to those at the end. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Alan. Thanks, Alan, for your patience while I was getting those technical issues sorted out. But Alan, is it okay if you speak for around 20 minutes or so? Does that kind of work for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, I'll leave you to it.
Okay, okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So first of all, Peter, outstanding job. And I actually was going in as you were talking and sort of shortening my presentation a little bit, because you covered a lot of things extremely well. So thank you for that. So I'm going to start off with just a very brief introduction of understanding ag. I'm sure most of y'all know who we are, but just in case you don't, we are actual farmers and ranchers. So we're real life farmers and ranchers. Many of us lifetime, some of us, have entered into it as first generation. I personally am sixth generation. So my family's been on their farm since 1840. We've consulted with thousands of farmers and ranchers around the world. We also work with quite a few large companies out there who now have expressed a distinct interest in regenerative agriculture, and you can see a list of some of those companies. That's not a definitive list, but some of them. We now have full-time consulting staff in the US, Canada, Mexico, and the UK. And we've consulted in more than 40 countries and are working across more than 34 million acres now. You got to have a definition for regenerative agriculture, and we define it like this: farming and ranching in synchrony with nature in the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with life within the soil and expanding to life above. And I really like this quote. I use it a lot in my presentations, and particularly when we're out in the field and doing field presentations. But this is a quote from W.C. Loudermilk, and he says, "The land does not lie. It bears a record of what men write on it, a record that is easy to read by those who understand the simple language of the land." So the bottom line is our management is written on the tapestry of the land. And for us, this is what regenerative agriculture, whether we're talking about, farming, ranching, agroforestry, silvopasture, whatever the case may be, this is what it's all about. It's about how can we create as much life and abundance and biodiversity as possible. And it's also about this: how can we reestablish a fully functioning carbon cycle? And I think in today's world, we have forgotten. We hear so much about carbon, 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 and the whole mantra is we got to remove carbon, remove carbon, remove carbon. And we forget that carbon is meant to cycle. Carbon must cycle if we're to continue to have thriving and vibrant life on this earth. So rather than the concept of thinking about within agriculture or anything else that we just simply have to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and sock it away in the soil, really what we need to be thinking about is how do we effectively and efficiently reestablish this fully functioning carbon cycle. That is what has always made life thrive, and it is what always will make life thrive. So our approach, what we have found, it doesn't matter what form of agriculture or agronomic enterprises you're looking at. So it really doesn't matter whether you're growing small grain crops, whether you're a livestock grazer, or whether you're participating in agroforestry of some sort. The 634 applies to all of us, irregardless. And obviously, that's the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. And just super quick, and y'all can, many of you are familiar with these, but if you're not, you can go on our website at understandingag.com and read a lot more about these. But the 6 principles are, first and foremost, we got to know our context. We can't really appropriately and adequately apply any of the other principles without first defining and truly knowing and understanding our context. Then we apply the other principles and the rules within our specific context. So what are the other principles? Well, minimize disturbance on the soil. Keep the soil armored or covered at all times. Create diversity. And I love what Peter was saying. Often when we think about diversity in farming or in grazing, we're thinking about, a diverse cover crop mix or more diversity in our pastures. But what Peter was talking about is critically important. We need to add even more diversity by adding back in trees, brushy species, woody species, things like that. The 5th principle is keep living roots in the soil year-round, and the 6th, animal integration. The 3 rules of adaptive stewardship are very simply these. The rule of compounding. Very quickly, there never are any singular effects in the real world. When we get out here on our farms and we're dealing with biology, we're dealing with nature, we're dealing with weather, there's never any singular effects. And there's no such thing as sustainability. You know, over the last couple of decades, we've heard a lot in agriculture about sustainability, and we need to be sustainable. Fact of the matter is, folks, we cannot be sustainable. That doesn't exist in agriculture. You're either moving forward or you're moving backwards. One of the two. There stasis does not exist in biology. We're constantly shifting. You know, if I continue to live, I get a year older every year. I can't stay at 30 years old for my entire life. So the rule of compounding is always at play, and it's never neutral. It's either positive or negative, and we have to understand that. So we have to ask ourselves the question, is what we're doing, including implementing agroforestry and silvopasture and things like that, is what we're doing creating positive compounding effects or negative compounding effects? So that's what we want to pay attention to and understand. And then the rule of compounding helps us to more appropriately apply the other two rules, and that is diversity, again, creating and sustaining on our operations and growing as much diversity as possible. And then what we call the rule of disruption, never being prescriptive in what we do and doing things the same way all the time, but instead realizing that we can introduce planned, purposeful disruptions to make ongoing incremental progress. And then we implement the 6 principles and the 3 rules to be able to optimize the 4 ecosystem processes. And those are energy flow, water cycle, and mineral cycle, or the nutrient cycle, and once again, diversity. Energy flow is photosynthesis. Way too many of our farms across the world, and we've worked again in many different countries, and we see the same issue coming up time and time again. We have focused so hard on monoculture cropping systems, even in our forestry systems in a lot of cases. And I'm going to talk about this a little more in just a moment. We focus on monoculture. You can never maximize photosynthetic capture and therefore energy generation and energy flow through any type of monoculture. So simply planting trees alone, if it's the same type of tree across all of our acres, is not going to help us maximize photosynthetic capture and energy flow. So what does that? Diversity in 2 ways in the plants that we have growing out there. Diversity in terms of stories of plants. So I like to see in all of my fields low growing, intermediate growing, and higher growing plants. Then I also want to see a wide variation in leaf architecture, leaf shape. So once we have diversity in stories of plants, and we have diversity in leaf shape or architecture, that's when we can begin to maximize photosynthetic capture and energy flow. Way too many farmers today have a lot of wasted sunlight. That's sunlight that is not intercepted by a plant leaf before it hits the soil surface. That's lost. That's lost energy. We have issues with our water cycle. We have a broken water cycle, a broken mineral cycle that we need to repair. And you'll notice that diversity was one of the 6 principles. Diversity was one of the 3 rules. And diversity is also one of the 4 ecosystem processes. So maybe there's something pretty darn important about diversity. So let me go through a quick example here, and then I'm going to spend just a few minutes in wrapping up my presentation, sort of adding a little bit more color and flavor to what Peter was talking about. So here you're looking at the Central Valley of California. And in the US, I don't know how many of you may have been to California and have gone through the Central Valley before, but this is considered one of the most important agricultural production areas in the entire US. And the Central Valley used to be this incredibly thriving area. And now much of it looks like this, pretty much desertified. But these are typical almond and walnut orchards in the Central Valley of California. They are actually taught to do their orchard production this way. They're taught to consistently spray herbicides to minimize vegetation in these orchards so that other vegetation will not compete for water and nutrients with the almond and walnut trees. This is actually one of the agricultural universities in California, and this is their, what they consider to be their research and model orchard. And the people that you see out there were one of our Soil Health Academy classes. So we took them here to this university orchard, and we went through it. We stuck a water infiltration ring in the ground. 2 hours later, not a bit of water had infiltrated. When you tried to stick a shovel in the ground here, the soil was heavily plated and compacted. You almost needed a pickaxe to do anything with the soil. And you can see pretty sparse vegetation. And in talking with university faculty and then the research technicians that managed this orchard, we found out that this orchard was sprayed with some type of pesticide, an average of 12 to 15 times a year. And they relied very heavily on irrigation and the use of synthetic fertility. But this is a way they think you've got to do everything. Okay. So can you do it very differently? Well, here we go. This is just 30 miles from where that university orchard is in the same Central Valley of California. And this is a regenerative walnut orchard. The owner of this orchard is Daniel Unruh, and Daniel attended his first Soil Health Academy in 2018. And his orchard at that time looked the same as all the other orchards around. But when he went through the Soil Health Academy, he decided he was going to make radical changes in the way that he did things and implement the 6 principles and the 3 rules in his orchard to be able to optimize the 4 ecosystem processes. And he did just that. And this was last year, pictures from his orchard. You can see it's radically different from the earlier pictures I showed you. Incredibly diverse cover crop mix growing up underneath the trees. Prior to this, he had a significant root-eating nematode problem that was severely damaging his walnut trees. And he tried all types of nematicide treatments, all the recommended treatments that the consultants were given to him, and none of them really were working. It wasn't until he started planting these diverse cover crop mixes that problem just absolutely disappeared without the use of applied nematicides. But then he did something else in here too, okay? And these are just some additional pictures of his orchards. This is what else he did. He went in and he added livestock to the equation and started grazing the livestock under his trees. And so here you see about 1,000 ewes that are now being grazed, and they're moved daily under polywire from paddock to paddock to paddock. So what has happened, in this whole situation? Well, what we now see is that they have radically reduced their reliance on irrigation, radically reduced any reliance on synthetic fertility or any type of pesticide, herbicide, insecticide, fungicide. His trees are far healthier. The nut crop is far healthier. And he's generating multiple revenue streams now off of the exact same acres on an annual basis. This is another regenerative orchard in the Central Valley of California, the Burris family farm. They're doing almonds, and you can see that they're doing something very similar here. So again, we're working with a lot of people throughout North America and again in other countries where we are implementing all of the 6 principles and the 3 rules within these orchard and silvopasture and agroforestry situations. And it is working incredibly well. So here you see some examples of agroforestry. You know, an agroforestry can be a combination of trees and livestock, or a combination of trees and crops, or trees, crops, and livestock. So all of that can be a critical component. I'm just going to give you a handful of some of the things that we have noticed when we implement silvopasture and agroforestry situations. And again, Peter did a great job of listing quite a few of those benefits and attributes. And I just want to expound on that just a little bit based on our experience. One of the things that Peter mentioned was livestock. When you turn them into these forestry or orchard situations, they'll begin to eat leaves off of the trees. And we notice on our own farm here in Mississippi that anytime we turn our livestock into a new paddock that has trees in it, that's the first place the livestock go. In any leaves that they can reach on that tree, they're going to start to eat on those leaves. Now, why do they do that? Well, we've actually analyzed those leaves and done phytonutrient analysis. And what we have found is that those leaves are very powerfully complex in terms of phytonutrient profile. And many of those phytonutrients are highly medicinal in nature. So the livestock know that they're getting something very beneficial from those leaves. And that's why they go to those trees first and eat leaves off those trees. So it's very beneficial to them from a medicinal and anti-parasitic standpoint. A lot of trees that we have tannin in the leaves, and those tannins are natural dewormers for our sheep, our goats, our cattle, all of that. But here's what else we find. And Peter mentioned this, but trees have a very extensive mycorrhizal network. And within that mycorrhizal network, what happens as soon as your animals start eating the leaves off these trees, that sends a signal from the tree down to the mycorrhizal network. And then that signal is transmitted within seconds to every tree in the area saying, we're being eaten on. Now you need to produce some phytochemicals that are not very palatable. And so you'll always notice that when they start eating on the trees, they won't just keep eating on the trees. They'll eat on the trees for maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes a little longer, and then suddenly stop. And then they will not eat from those trees the rest of the day. That is because of that signal being sent by the mycorrhizal network. And those trees are now producing some distasteful phytonutrients or phytochemical compounds that the livestock say, okay, I've had enough. And then they go to grazing. I mentioned earlier that many people, when they plant trees, are planting monocultures of trees. That's just like planting a monoculture of corn or wheat or barley or anything else, or ryegrass. It's a monoculture. We far prefer to have variety and diversity in our trees and our woody species, just like we do our grasses, legumes, and forbs. Here where I live in the deep south of the US, there's millions of acres that are planted in hybrid pine trees for timber production. These hybrid pines become essentially what I call a pine desert. Over time, practically nothing can live in them or survive in them and thrive in them, even wildlife. So they're pretty much abandoned. They truly are like a desert, with the exception of just the lone pine trees growing in there. So what we do, the upper left-hand picture, you see a bunch of goats in amongst these hybrid pine trees. and you see lots and lots of forage growing there. So we turned this situation into something very different. And here again in these pictures, you can see we have sheep, we have cattle into these pine, what are called pine plantations down here. And it turns them into something that rather than being a pine desert, they are now vibrant and they support multiple species of livestock and reattract many, many different species of wildlife, including birds, ground nesting birds, deer, turkey, all of those types of things. So we have a lot more support there than we would have had in the past. So again, Peter did an outstanding job of illustrating a lot of the benefits that we see. What we have found is that you can very easily integrate silvopasture or agroforestry situations about anywhere that you need to. Here in the U.S., and certainly from what we have seen in our time in the UK as well, farmers have opened up way too many acres. And why? Because we want to use bigger and bigger equipment unimpeded. And we rip out all the hedgerows, we rip out all the trees, we rip out the woodland, things like that. And that is very, very detrimental. It's detrimental to soil health and biology. It's detrimental to preventing water and wind erosion. You know, Peter showed the picture of the guy out there plowing and dust billowing up as he was plowing. We are also seeing a lot more nutrient runoff and loss and algal blooms in our waterways and things like that, and dead zones in our waterways as a result of this. So agroforestry, what we have found, can be a vital component of revitalizing the productivity of your farm. It can significantly improve how rapidly you can improve soil health parameters. It can draw in more wildlife. It can make your livestock and cropping production more profitable. And it can greatly reduce the negative effects that we see today from farming and ranching and help us to reduce the negative climate effects. So I'm going to stop right there so that we have plenty of time for questions and Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Alan. Just mindful of time, so I'm going to go straight to Ed to talk a little bit around designing agroforestry systems in a UK context. But if you can be adding your questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll hopefully have a few minutes for those at the end.
Great. Hi, everybody. I will try and be rapid because we are running out of time. Let me just share my screen quickly. All right. Hopefully that is coming up.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, that's there. Great. Let's get that playing. Okay, so my name is Edd Colbert. I work as an independent agroforestry consultant, working with farmers, foresters, and funders to create effective agroforestry systems for a variety of objectives. I like to think about agroforestry not as a tool, as an individual tool. And I think we've touched on this, but I want to make it really explicit to rather see it as a toolbox. And the reason for that is there are so many different types. I won't reiterate all of those. They have already been discussed today, but rather just look at how we can distinguish the different types of agroforestry depending on the different systems we're working with and the location of the farm there as well. I'd like to try and move into, rather than think about what agroforestry is, very quickly go through some ideas around how we might go about designing an agroforestry system to get more into the practical components. But as I say, I might try and leave a bit more space for some questions so we can be a bit more interactive in this sense. There's a variety of frameworks out there, design processes you can go through. This is one that I'd like to work with, make things quite simple. The key thing with any intervention on a farm, really, whether it's agroforestry or not, is to really understand why you're doing it. to have a clear objective or objectives in mind, and I'll look at that in a moment. Following from there, thinking about where on the farm it might be, both in terms of location of the farm, whether it's within a field, on the edges of a field, the orientation of tree lines or blocks of trees. Then begin thinking about what exactly that pattern is going to start looking like, the spacing of the trees, the density, species in certain aspects. You might be considering different varieties within a species range as well. And
just to say, Ed, since you went to full screen, I'm afraid I'm just seeing a loading page rather than your slideshow. So you're really clear without the slides, but just to let you know that I'm afraid they're no longer.
Okay, is that better? Can you see it now?
Not yet. You might need to refresh the page. You've got them open on that might bring them back.
Is that coming up?
I'm not seeing them for me, but as I say, I think you're really clear without them. So feel free just to carry on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll assume you're not seeing them and just try and go through some of these ideas anyway. So as I was saying, a bit of a back and forth process between understanding clearly what your objectives are, beginning to think about where you're going to place those trees on the farm, and then getting into the finer details of the various design parameters and specific species. And you'll likely go backwards and forwards through these first three stages before then going into thinking about establishment plans, protection plans, how are you going to integrate these trees with livestock, with wild mammals that might have a kind of predatory effect on the trees, what kind of fences you're going to use, and then finally asking yourself when and with who. So what timelines are you going to be working towards? Are you going to be establishing and managing these trees in-house or working with contractors? Making sure that you're really planning far enough in advance. So this is, at least in the UK context, we're in the midst of tree planting season, but it's also key time of the year for tree planning. In the UK, we're increasingly seeing a reduction in the supply of trees available, and for certain funding, a reduction in the availability of native or UK sourced trees. So it's really important to be thinking sort of at least 10 or 11 months ahead of the following year's planting season, ideally even further ahead if possible. It's a real shame you can't see the slides. Maybe you can, but just to speak a bit more about objectives, I think that two key questions that are really worth asking yourselves to break down what exactly we mean by objectives or goals or ambitions. The first is, what are the opportunities that you're trying to unlock? It might be, as we've discussed, diversification on the farm for economic resilience. It might be production of woody biomass. Maybe you want to offset on-farm costs around heating or energy supply, fencing even, or wood chip for bedding. You might be looking to diversify the activity on the farm, perhaps bringing in a sense of agritourism, utilizing tree lanes or treescapes for that, or looking towards creating more value addition, thinking about, for example, traditional, I'm currently in Spain, where there's a tradition of oak finished pork, which goes for very high prices. So the first question, what are the opportunities you're trying to unlock? The second is, what are the challenges you're trying to overcome? And it might be you're trying to unlock opportunities and overcome challenges, or just one or the other. Some of those challenges we've discussed: increasing climate volatility, major effects not just on livestock, but also on crops from exposure to much hotter summers, more wind, more erratic weather conditions, and unpredictable rainfall. It might be you're trying to overcome mortality issues or sickness in livestock, pest and disease, increasing input costs on the farm. Really understanding what your top 3, maximum top 5 objectives are will really help then design a system that is going to help you achieve those objectives. I think if my screen is not showing anything at the moment, it's going to be a bit limiting because the rest of my slides are in image form. Are you still not seeing anything there, Matt?
I'm afraid I'm not, but it could be on mine. Pete or Alan, can you see Ed's slides?
I'm sorry, no, we can't. No,
No,
it just says loading.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a real shame. I'm just going to try and refresh it very quickly. Any better? Or?
Yeah, brilliant. Just don't put onto full screen and just toggle through.
Right.
Yeah.
Leave it there. Okay, so we've been through objective setting now. Just to recap, understanding why you're doing what you're doing, then beginning to think about where and what you're going to be doing. For each of the different systems that we've discussed already, there are a range of different questions you want to be going through. We've spoken about various forms of alley cropping. So here we've got an example of short rotation coppice, another design here that I created for a farm near Marlborough with the fruit trees running through arable. Similarly here up in Yorkshire, polyculture, alley cropping and arable system. In these systems, you're going to be thinking about what are your machinery widths if you're mechanized, thinking about the area that you need, minimum areas that you need, not just for the present in terms of the machinery used nowadays, but also in the future, looking towards trends. Are you likely to increase the size of your machines, or is it more the case that actually you might be beginning to shrink down the machinery that you're using on the site, and trying where possible to future-proof the farming system by having the most flexible design as possible there. You might also be considering different types of fruit varieties. And so again, particularly with fruit, you'll be thinking about what rootstock you want to choose, whether you want dwarfing varieties all the way through to much larger varieties. And your decision there is going to be based on the timeframes you're working to, how quickly you want fruit, what varieties of fruit you're looking for, the management styles and techniques, but also things like how much shade is going to impact the crops you're working with. You may hear from a lot of agroforesters the need to really think carefully about orientation, which is certainly true in terms of arable and horticulture crops, where possible opting for a north-south orientation to tree lines to maximize light exposure throughout the day. When it comes to silver pasture alleys, this is slightly less of an issue. Grass does seem to grow fairly well in some degree of shade. And of course, you're going to be thinking about designing systems to actually maximize shade for livestock or maximize wind protection for livestock. And so your orientation in that regard is going to be moving more toward or against the prevailing wind in the area that you're working. You might have to try and think about two different systems here. So in the case of an orchard grazing, we saw some great examples from Alan earlier of these walnut and almond orchards. You need to be optimizing the system for the fruit trees to have the space to be pruned and managed annually, to be harvested from, but to not be affected negatively by any stock that are grazing underneath. Here, you've got a great opportunity, particularly for those of you who are practicing cell grazing with electric fencing, to stack the use of your fencing as both a tree protection mechanism and a livestock management tool as well. So far, we've looked at linear planting, straight lines, obviously very useful for mechanized systems. But for those of you on more undulating topography and hillsides, contour planting can be really useful. Here we've got two examples of design in Shropshire here, and this one in Yorkshire again. Trying to work with the natural form of the land to reduce runoff, reduce soil erosion, and really try and slow the flow of water across the landscape. Contour planting can be absolutely brilliant for that. It does, however, come with its complications of not being as straightforward. And so where mechanized agriculture needs to take place, some adjustments need to be allowed for there as well. Obviously, when we start thinking about things like wood pasture, or even thinking about bringing our livestock into the woodland, in this case, looking at pigs on beech and oak masts there, we need to start thinking about different components, not just the kind of main focus we've looked at so far is mechanization and the movement of the animals, but beginning, particularly in the woodland, to think about the health of existing trees, making sure that we're not over grazing these landscapes, which can be incredibly sensitive. And again, that's going to be drawn from a lot of the work that Understanding Ag and the Regenerate team are promoting through holistic and adaptive grazing. Finally, 3 sort of edge agroforestries we've discussed here, you're probably already doing. So you, as a farmer, if you have hedgerows, I would class you as an agroforester. You don't need to be convinced, you're already doing it. And sometimes it's just as important to think about these hedges and edges to understand whether or not you're really getting the value you could be from those systems. If you're looking after them in the right way, it might be they can be extended into shelter belts to provide even more shelter. It could be that fruiting trees can be added to those to provide additional productivity on the land. And where possible around waterways, extending hedges or natural regeneration into larger buffer areas as well. I won't go too much into food forests. We've touched on them. The design considerations there are vast in comparison to some of these more simplistic systems, but really worth considering, particularly in urban settings. And we can draw a lot of ideas from food forests in terms of their promotion of diversity, multiple layers and stacking of functions, and apply those ideas into some of these more linear agroforestry systems as well. To wrap up, I've just pulled this from the UK government website. So last week they announced the new standards and the pricing for agroforestry in SFI. There's yet to be more detail on these, so I just wanted to share these for anyone who is interested. You can go onto the UK government website and see their announcements from last week. These are per hectare per year payment rates for in-field agroforestry in comparison to the wood pasture and hedgerow standards that have been around for a while now. So that was a incredibly rapid run through of an agroforestry design process, which would normally take a lot longer to complete. If anyone is interested to go through that or to talk about it in more detail, obviously happy to have questions now, but also feel free to get in touch. I'm more than happy to chat about any ideas you have on your land.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ed. That was a really good kind of practical grounding for what we've heard so far, for people to kind of start thinking through some of the considerations of if they were going to do this sort of thing on their farm. I'm aware we've only got 5 minutes, so if you do have questions, please stick them in the Q&A and we'll try and get to them. But Ed, I'm aware you've got to drop off shortly, but if you could just do one question maybe before you head off, and that's, I think that often people think about planting agroforestry maybe for timber or for having a food producing component, and so it's easy to kind of let your mind kind of separate into those 2 different classes. And I was interested in one of those agroforestry systems you brought up that had, you know, within one arable field, a mix of food producing and timber producing, and some shrubs that were food producing and others that weren't. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of, you know, considerations around balancing different uses within one agroforestry design?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's good to have in the back of your mind this sort of spectrum that we're working on in agriculture. On the one hand, we can think of systems that are entirely optimized for commercial productivity, dare I say, kind of an industrial paradigm. On the other, we have full-blown nature optimization, nature priority, and moving more toward a kind of rewilding sense of land management. And as agroecological or regenerative land managers, or you know, pick your buzzword, if you're trying to engage with looking after the land and bringing it into better health, our task is to dance between these 2 edges and find within our context where exactly we find ourselves. So the more that we create more diversity in those systems, the more we add timber, fruit, nut, trees just for biodiversity's sake, the more we're edging toward that more environmental or ecological focus. And we have to find a way that we are still able to manage the farm in a commercial way, and there'll be a point where we're edging towards so much complexity it becomes actually a lot harder, in some cases more costly to also manage. The example that you're referring to in the slides there, and I'm happy to share those slides later on as well, is a system where I'm working with a farmer who's thinking of a kind of 200-year plan of taking an arable parcel of land and having a 200-year plan of turning that into a wide-spaced parkland or wood pasture, ultimately reverting it into permanent pasture understory. The oak trees, I think we've got things like field maple and hornbeam in there, so these timber trees that will are designed to eventually be the kind of large standing standard specimen trees within that parkland landscape. And the fruit trees and the nut trees and the other shrubs, you could view them in the forestry term as nurse crops. They're kind of filling in the gaps in between. They're providing additional functions to that land and to the crops there as well. But ultimately, they're far shorter lived, and at a certain point, their productivity will peak. They'll be taken out as that land is moved from a silver arable system toward a silver pastoral system, towards a wood pasture, and ultimately this kind of rangeland instead. So it's very specific to the context of that particular estate, and there is no recipe. You know, you could look at that and be inspired by that idea. It's unlikely that you would lift that exact idea and put it across into your own. You've got to find what's right for you and what you're going to be able to manage. And that's what's truly, dare I say, sustainable is an idea or a design that you're going to enjoy and you're going to be able to work with for years to come. You know, this is a long-term commitment.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thanks, Ed. I'm aware that some people are having issues with the Q&A function not working. So if you did have questions that you wanted to ask that you haven't been able to get to work on Teams, then please send one of the Regenerate team an email, and we'll put you in touch with the relevant person and get your question answered after the event. So apologies if that's affected you, but we do have one question here that I think maybe Alan could take around, does shading cause a significant loss of production in arable agroforestry systems? Ed, I guess you might have a UK perspective as well on that. And then I think we'll probably bring things to a close. But yeah, Alan, fire away.
So on the, it's a matter of spacing of the trees. You obviously have to understand your spacing. And then there are many, many different plant species that grow quite well that are good forage species for livestock within shade, so that's another reason for diversity in absolutely everything out there. So you've got to consider tree spacing, shrub spacing, that type of thing in an agroforestry or silver pasture type situation. And that's certainly something that, we've worked with quite a bit and can help people with depending on their situation. And then you have to look at what plant species that are grazable by the livestock will grow under that canopy, of those trees or those shrubs. So those are the two critical things that you have to think about to be able to mitigate, those types of issues. There's no need to have bare ground underneath our trees. That should not happen. And if that's happening, it's more of a management issue than it is an issue with the trees and with what can grow there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. Ed, what do you find with some of your clients in the UK around growing cereals and so on under a tree component?
Yeah, I think if you go out into any field now where there are large standing trees on the southern or southerly borders of an arable field, you will be able to see a drop off in the height of the crops where the shade is then being caused. It's a natural phenomenon, as we spoke about earlier with photosynthesis. They're just unable to compete with these larger canopies. So it is a real concern. Alan's mentioned spacing, so in that regard, I presume what was meant there is that the width of those cropping alleys, the wider the alleys are, the greater light exposure you can get. We mentioned also the north-south orientation, so where possible, having a equal dispersion of light throughout the day can mitigate that. Tree type, so having shorter growing trees. If we're looking at fruit trees, we can be going for dwarfing or semi-dwarfing trees, are going to cause less shading. We can increase the distance within a tree row. So we've spoken about the width between two tree rows, but in a single tree row, have wider spaces, again, to allow more light in. And then the final thing that can mitigate against some of these very real concerns around shade is the way in which these trees are managed, particularly if we think about timber trees, high pruning timber trees, so that the crown of the tree is risen up. We've got more space, more airflow around the stem of the tree, can also allow more light to come in. So yeah, it's a real concern for vegetables, cereals, arable crops. But if the context still calls for trees, it still makes sense, then there are things you can do to mitigate against that.
Thanks, Ed. And I suppose just to add to that, there was some PhD research done at Reading University a couple of years ago that was kind of measuring the benefit of having natural insect enemies of crop pests in the kind of understory of those row components in agroforestry systems, which does give some mitigation effect to any kind of loss from shade. You may be saving applying a kind of insecticide or whatever product, and so that although the total yield might be a little bit reduced, the margin can still compare quite favorably. And there's been some interesting studies in a pasture system that have found that although there's a shading component from having trees around or within fields, you can actually end up with higher grass growth, particularly at the shoulders of the season, just by reducing the wind chill that can kind of knock the top off young grass, particularly in March and so on. And so often farmers finding having more of an early bite available by reducing that wind chill effect. Brilliant. Well, I mean, we've run over time there a little bit by 5 minutes, but thanks very much to Ed, Pete and Alan for your presentations, and thank you all for joining this evening. And as I say, if you do have any questions or you'd like to chat offline with the panelists, please let us know. We'll put you in touch. But I'll let you enjoy your evenings, and thank you all once again. Cheers, guys.